We're very honored here today to have Arnold Roth come all the way from Israel. And I'm not going to do much talking. I just want to say that what he experienced in his life is, I hope, what none of us ever have to experience in ours with anybody we know. I could hardly write an email to Arnold without crying, even when I wasn't mentioning it. But he will talk all about it. I just want to say that I became emotionally involved in the Israel issue when the evacuation of Gush Katif. I became physically and financially involved when the 3 soldiers were kidnapped, one of whom was Gilad Shalit, who's the only one who came back alive. And the whole issue of what Israel does is exchanging one person or body parts of a Jew for thousands of the enemy, convicted enemy, is beyond our imagination. There's no other country in the world that is pushed into a situation like that. And anyway, so that's all I want to say. And thank you very much. And thank you, Arnold.
It's good to be a Jew because you walk into environments far from the territory with which you're familiar and find yourself entirely at home with people, in many cases with whom you have a tremendous amount in common. I can't judge how loud my voice is relative to the room. If I'm speaking, if I speak louder, I'll speak louder and I'll make it as loud as it needs to be. I'm going to touch on a number of issues that are interconnected one with the other. And I'm going to start with a background that, against which my life has been played out. I grew up in Melbourne, Australia, where my parents came as refugees after the war. The Melbourne Jewish community is absolutely unique in the world in the proportion of survivors of the Holocaust relative to the size of the community. The community is overwhelmingly, at least in my generation, a community of survivors. Most people are exactly like my parents, arrived in Australia with devoid of many of the normal things that we struggle to put together in life: family connections, property, money, the ability to exercise your freedom. All of these things were, of course, taken from them in the course of the bitter experience that overcame European Jewry. Both my parents are graduates of the University of Auschwitz, and my mother is from the Polish side of the story, my father from the Galiciana side of the story, and so were all of the friends that I grew up with. So the result is that everybody that I know in the Melbourne community, which means my cohort, people with whom I grew up, were raised in an environment where none of us had a single grandparent and where everything was focused on children, on the future, on get an education, on get ahead. Much less emphasis on some of the other things that perhaps in a more relaxed environment we might focus. For instance, my upbringing was notably short of any emphasis on Judaism as a religion. Not that we weren't traditional, we certainly were, and not that my parents didn't know about the finest of fine details in Jewish life. They did, but the Holocaust, their experience as inmates of, in my father's case, Ghetto Krakow, in the case of my mother, Ghetto Łódź, and then their experience in work camps and concentration camps, exacted a price from them that for me is difficult to assess, but which I can certainly recognize, because I see exactly the same among the parents and the family backgrounds of everyone that I know of that generation, people that I grew up with. What made it also distinctive is that they walked into a community that almost did not exist. Melbourne today, for those of you who had the privilege of visiting, or even hearing about it, is one of the most congenial and pleasant and comfortable and successful communities anywhere. It's a marvelous place to be from. People asked us when we made Aliyah as a family, my wife and I and our children, in 88, good calculation, been living in Israel for 25 years. Why did you leave Australia? In their ignorance, they thought that Australia and Melbourne are the same thing, but they're not. Melbourne is utterly unique, and Melbourne is the other way around. Australia is unique, and Melbourne is utterly unique. Marvellous place. But I'm not here to sell Australia, I'm here to describe how the particular experience and the value formation, the ideas that have guided some of the decisions that I've either wanted to take or been forced to take, were taken against a background of a Jewish life in which children were the epicenter. They were the everything. I was the everything in my parents' life. I shared being the everything with my brother. And so it was with everybody that I know. We were everything for our parents. As I look back now and realise that my parents came to Australia without their parents, without, in most cases, their siblings. The truth is my mother did come with sisters, but she lost all her brothers. My father came with nobody, and he was one of 17 children. Was so difficult that I had difficulty even formulating the ideas about what must they have gone through. I know only the externalities. I know about the nightmares. I know about my parents waking up in the middle of the night and making a racket. And my parents were quiet people. It's not that they were accustomed to making a racket, but the turmoil that was going on in there I had no idea about until, in a certain way, I experienced a taste of it in my own life. And having tasted it, my appreciation, my admiration, my inability to comprehend how they managed to put one foot in front of the other, how they managed to start businesses out of nowhere, to send us to good schools, to imbue us with optimism. It's a terribly, terribly precious commodity. Optimism. Particularly, and I don't need to belabor the point, in an environment in which so many people will tell you, well, we are so oppressed, we are desperate, and therefore the only thing which we can do is to take our children and sacrifice them in some explosion. That kind of an approach is so far from reality. It's totally contrived. And I know that because I was raised by parents who lost everything. And I'm part of a generation, and I know many of you are as well, who experienced precisely the same thing. Well, we'll come back to this a little later on. There were three seminal points that I think seminal points that I've written about. I wrote an essay. I'm not urging anybody to read it, but it's important for me to mention it. Called 15. I say 15 has a special significance because 15 is the age that my mother was when the Germans took over her town. The town was called Wielun. It was in the area around Łódź in Poland, and that was the end of the first part of her life. Everything changed. The Jews of Wielun were under German occupation almost from the first day of the war, and in the case of my mother and her sisters, they ended up going through Auschwitz and work camps and every kind of hell and nightmare, only to survive. They survived and they made productive, constructive and optimistic lives. That was the experience that my mother encountered when she was 15. When I was 15, the Six-Day War broke out. The Six-Day War broke out and was prosecuted and conducted and completed, and we all know that the outcome was something utterly extraordinary. For me, I have to tell you, that was a turning point in my life, at least up until that point. 15 was when I realized that actually being Jewish was quite central to the way I thought about the world. It wasn't until that point. I saw myself as an Australian kid. At the age of 15, I realized that what was going on the news, far away in the Middle East, with all the anxieties of the threats by the Egyptians, which we will remember well, and the pusillanimous conduct of the United Nations, and the total failure of support by the erstwhile Friends of Israel, the French, and the totally ambiguous role played by the United States of America. All of these things emphasized, if the point needed to be emphasized, how utterly alone we were and how totally dependent on our own resources we Jews were. It wasn't a joke. It was a serious issue. I felt it in my home. Unlike you Americans, you North Americans, the Six-Day War was played out in the depths of winter. for us Australians. I remember that walking home from school on the 5th of June when the war broke out and finding my parents at home terribly overcome by anxiety. It was a foggy day, you could barely see a metre in front of you. The atmosphere was entirely appropriate to what was going on. Well, that was when I was 15, and in 1967 I made certain decisions in life. I decided to take myself out of the government school that I had been a student at, and take myself, not that my parents objected, but take myself to a Jewish school. I spent the last 2 years of high school in a Jewish school, and from then I've made efforts to adopt a life in which Jewish values, in particular halakha, plays a much more central role. And in the course of time, I've had the privilege of being able to raise children in that same spirit. So that was my 15. The oldest of my daughters was 15 in 2001. I need to tell you a few things about her before I move on. My wife and I made the decision to make Aliyah the first day we met. Or to put that more precisely, my wife made the decision. I was already a lawyer when I decided to take myself to Yeshiva University in 1975. And in the course of what to me was a life-changing year, I met and began to date a young woman from Kew Gardens in Queens. And on our very first date, she said to me, "Well, and what's your attitude to Aliyah?" I had the right answer because we're married now for 36 years. But at the time, it wasn't obvious to me that that was what I wanted. At that particular moment, it became obvious. She imposed eventually a condition, not on the first date, because the first date was just a first date. But as we got closer, we did have some discussions about what might follow, and eventually she agreed, after I proposed marriage using the email of those days. We used to call that particular network aerograms. Some of you may remember them. Composed a two-part proposal of marriage in a two-part aerogram. Part 2, by the way, arrived 2 days before part 1. I promised Frimet that we would be spending no more than 7 years in Australia, thinking to myself that there has never been a person born who came to Australia without falling in love with the place, and the future would take care of itself. Well, in the end, after 12 years of marriage, I satisfied my promise of after 7 years we're going to go to Israel, a little bit late. And when we did, we came with 4 children. The youngest of our children was, we had 3 sons, and the youngest of our children was 2 years old. Her name was Malki. We came to Israel full of optimism, and thank God I can tell you that Israel has been a rewarding and fulfilling existence for us. We're a happy family by and large, confronting certain quite distinct challenges, but nevertheless happy and satisfied and acknowledging many blessings. We have a lot of pleasure from our children, and thank God for our grandchildren. At a certain point, the youngest of our children had what we call a medical accident. The result of something that happened in hospital when she was a year old left her blind and profoundly brain damaged. And so she is today. Today she's 18 years old, but she used to be younger and smaller, and when she was, her oldest sister, Malki, embraced her, adored her, and showed a maturity of understanding that I think most adults, myself included, are incapable of reaching. The understanding that she had, I can say now looking backwards, was to recognize that there are certain situations, certain people in life where all you can do is give. There's not going to be anything coming back. You're not going to smile at this person and get a smile back. My daughter doesn't smile anymore. She smiled for the first year of her life. She doesn't smile now. You're going to hug her and hold her close to you so that she feels the warmth and knows that there's somebody who cares for her. You'll take her to your bed with you when you're 9 years old, and you won't get anything back. She won't cook with you, she won't sing with you. It's entirely one way. But you're going to feel marvelous about it because you know that you're doing something that from the point of view of this child whose brain is damaged, hopelessly damaged, who can't form any thoughts, who can't communicate, but who is nevertheless a human being, capable, as we now know, years later, of such simple things as saying yes and know. She knows how to do this now. It came after years of training. I'm speaking of our youngest child. That didn't exist at the time. Malki would carry her youngest sister, whose name is Chaya Yesheva, with her to bed, would hold her close, would go to the hospital with my wife whenever we had prolonged periods of hospitalization. In short, this was a child who understood the power of giving. Once she absorbed that, she began transmitting it to others. She became a youth leader in an organization called Ezra, which is quite well known in Israel, almost not at all known outside Israel. She became an agent for change in her own school, where there was a mainstream class of children with challenges, educational challenges, who were not being absorbed properly. The kids who didn't have challenges were keeping their distance, and it was an unsatisfactory situation. Malki was the agent. She moved between the two. She enabled the wall to be overcome, and she achieved wonderful things. In the summer of 2000, when Malki was 14 years old, she told my wife, this summer, for my vacation, I'm going to look for a family where I can make a difference. I'm going to look for a mother who has a very disabled child, and I'm going to be the mother's helper. And she set out and found exactly such a situation. It was quite extraordinary. She found a young woman living in our community who had only one child. This child suffered from a Jewish genetic disease. Can anybody guess the name?
Yes.
Not Tay-Sachs. Okay. I want everybody to know that there's more than one serious Jewish genetic disease, Latarina, unfortunately. This happens to be Canavan's disease. This young boy, very young, suffered from Canavan's disease, was on a path to a certain end, and his mother was,
We missed the name of that.
Canavan's disease.
Oh,
Canavan's disease. Less well known than Tay-Sachs, but unfortunately with the same kind of bitter outcome.
Is it where you age very rapidly?
No, I don't know the name of that, but it's not that.
Yeah.
It's a neurological disease. The details, frankly, I don't know, but I can tell you, having seen the child and been there at the time, he had to be fed with a tube.
Yeah.
He was non-verbal. He would smile beautifully. He would light up the room, but he couldn't communicate in other ways. And he was slowly dying in front of our eyes, and the mother knew this. The father's role was the traditional father's role in illnesses of this kind. As soon as the diagnosis was pronounced, he left the wife, and therefore she was really entirely on her own. Malki made the difference for one summer, and it was a big difference. In the summer of 2001, we're talking a year later, Malki heard about an organization called Etgarim. Etgarim is modern Hebrew. You don't find the word in the Bible, and it means Etgar, challenge. It's an organization that exists in order to create a summer holiday experience for children with, on one hand, serious cognitive disabilities, on the other hand, serious physical disabilities. Malki and a school friend, both 15-year-old girls, threw themselves against the gates of the Etgarim camp on the shores of the Kinneret in the north and said, we're here to be volunteers. And they were told, we don't take volunteers. And they said, we know you don't take volunteers. We're here to be volunteers. And eventually they were taken in. They spent a momentous 5 or so days there, and came home full of, Malki came home with a smile from ear to ear. She had stories, but we never really heard them, and 2 days later she was killed. The circumstances in which Malki was killed are somewhat well known, but probably not to people who are not her parents. Malki was standing at the counter of the Sbarro restaurant in the center of Jerusalem on the 9th of August 2001 with her best friend, Michal Raziel. Michal's family lived almost next door to us. It was their home that we moved into on the night that we made Aliyah. They were living in England at the time. Subsequently, the father, Shlomo, became ill in England. The family asked for their apartment back. My wife was pregnant at that time with our next daughter. We gave back the apartment, though we didn't have to, and we subsequently became friends with the Raziel family. Unfortunately, the husband became iller and eventually died, leaving a young widow with 4 daughters under the age of about 14 or 15. Malki became very attached to the youngest of the daughters, Michal, and they became best friends. They were standing together at the counter of the restaurant when the Hamas terrorist, carrying a guitar case on his back, filled with explosives, not with a guitar, walked in and detonated himself while standing next to them, and killed in that action himself, of course, and 15 innocent young Israelis, a majority of them children, and a 16th woman who's been in a comatose state from that day until today. So really 16 victims and 130 people, many of them outside the restaurant, who were maimed by the massive explosion. This began the next chapter of the life of my family, an entirely different chapter, a chapter for which we actually had not only no guidance, no book of instructions, no dummy's guide to living in the wake of the murder of your loved child, but we kept running up against serious problems in our environment, in the neighborhood, in the family, in relations with employers, relations with people who we see at the pool. It's terra incognita. There is a library, and you can see it when you walk into a bookstore. Do they still have bookstores in America? Okay. When you're browsing Barnes & Noble or Amazon, or looking on your Kindle, there is an entire literature of living with grief, living with bereavement. There's a far smaller literature of living in the wake of a death by crime. The literature for living after an act of terrorism doesn't exist yet. There are no books. And the issues are profound. I had occasion to speak this morning to a different group about the commonality of experience that I've been able to trace through speaking with many terror victims from other cultures. There are powerful things we have in common, even though the differences among us are tremendous. Differences of language and politics and culture, but the things that we have in common, the same issues keep coming up again and again. Why doesn't my mother-in-law understand? Why, when I walk on the street, do my neighbours sometimes cross to the other side? It's not because I offended them, it's not because they offended me. They don't know what to say. And I don't know what to say. And I wish people had a better understanding. I wish that there was some basic instruction given to people of how to live with a family who have lost a child to an act of terror. It's a lottery. It's a gamble. You don't know if it's going to be your child or your father or your partner or your sibling who's going to be killed the next time the terrorists set out to kill innocent people, and they certainly will, and this is a true statement no matter where on the surface of the earth I'm speaking. Terrorism is prevailing, it's winning, it's expanding. It's not under control, it's not under retreat. Those instructions don't exist. That sensitivity, by and large, doesn't exist. Simply knowing that that is an unknown issue which generates tremendous unhappiness is almost itself an unperceived reality. But it's not about that I want to speak here today. The massacre at the Sbarro restaurant was engineered by one person. That person was present and did not blow up that day. In fact, that person, though present at the explosion, fled, giving instructions to the bomb, who was a religiously maddened young man from a property-owning family in the Samaria district, giving instructions not to explode until the planner had managed to get away. The planner not only got away, but she went to her evening job, which was to read the news on Palestinian Authority television in Ramallah, where she sat in front of the cameras at 7 o'clock that evening and reported on the events that had taken place in Jerusalem that afternoon, without, of course, any suggestion that it was she who engineered the massacre herself. In the fullness of the following month, she was arrested on the basis of tips from cooperating Palestinian Arabs, put on trial, convicted on her own confession, and sentenced to 16 life terms. She was not the first person to be sentenced to a very large, almost unimaginably lengthy term of imprisonment for an act of terrorism. She certainly was the first woman. In fact, I believe that the claim is made that she's the first female terrorist in the service of Hamas. But that's a mere detail. What's significant here is that at all stages in the process of her interaction with the Israeli system, she said, I did it, I'm glad I did it, and give me a chance and I will do it again. And more than that, I'm going to show other people how great it is to do what I did. A person like that, you would not want to have wandering around on the streets, let alone presenting the news or being anywhere near a camera or a microphone. My wife and I became aware of this woman's existence and her public statements without any help from the authorities. We were never told of her arrest, of her trial, of her conviction, of her admission by anybody other than what we heard on the news or read on the internet. The Israeli legal and justice system cooperated with us, not at all. Absolute zero. I have to say, up until this very day, when we found out the kind of values that she projected, that she represented, that she embodied, we became sensitive to the idea that at some stage, somebody is going to want to see this woman out and free again. She's so valuable, so potent. She's young. She was 21 when she engineered the massacre at Sbarro. She's charismatic. People followed her footsteps. She's articulate. She's effective. She's ideologically motivated and committed. And she says, I want to see this happen again and again. In a normal place where the sky is blue, most people would say you'd have to have rocks in your head to ever allow a person like this out of the incarceration system. And in fact, the judge who sentenced her said, with zero publicity, and I think I'm one of the few people who knows about it, because I exercised my rights and demanded the transcript of the court case. The judge said, and we, the tribunal, there were 3 judges, declare here that this prisoner must never be considered for parole or any early release. Have you ever heard that before? You haven't heard it before. Starting in about 2005, the efforts to have her released began, and we were aware of them. We saw them in the media. And sometime after that, in the wake of the kidnapping, the hostage-taking of the soldier Shalit, it became clear that the strategy of Hamas was to use the hostage as a lever for achieving a showcase achievement, a showcase release of prisoners. It's a major issue in Palestinian Arab culture, the release of prisoners, because it plays right to the heart of the honour and shame culture that characterises the lives that they live. It's unthinkable that the Israelis, which means the Jews, who have a low place in the value system of Islam, should be dictating to us, the Muslims, how we conduct our lives and how what we do to achieve the release of people who, by our lights, are heroes. Well, that campaign began for us as soon as it became clear that the Shalit hostage-taking was a calculated move to release prisoners like this woman whose name is Ahlam Tamimi. And both of us, my wife and I, began writing at every opportunity when no one heard of Ahlam Tamimi, and where it was not widely recognized that there was a deal that was going to be proposed. So that by the time the deal was proposed some years later, we found ourselves recycling things that we had said and written to other audiences, pointing out the folly, and that's a very mild word, the folly of ever seriously contemplating allowing this woman out again. And then lo and behold, we discovered that there were serious voices from within Israeli society saying, we may want to argue about the men, but the women, and a more foolish, self-defeating approach than that, it's hard for me to imagine. Because as events have demonstrated subsequently, the potency of the message of a woman, a young woman, a symbol of motherhood, by the way, she's going to have a baby in the next couple of weeks, the symbol of motherhood, the symbol of everything that is embracing and warm and that basic and home-oriented, as a symbol of murder in the service of your religion, this is a winning combination in that culture, as we've discovered. Well, subsequently, the Shalit deal took on very concrete form. It was eventually announced on the night before Sukkot in 2011. I say that because I remember very distinctly being on a ladder, hammering together the sukkah on our balcony. My wife was asleep. My wife the life of my wife is very much affected by the need to work with our youngest child, who, as I said before, is now 18 and needs round-the-clock care. My wife does more than I can say on this occasion, and to protect her privacy, I won't go into any of the details, but she devotes herself totally to trying to get the most out of life for our youngest, whose name is Chaya Elisheva. And she was having a nap because she was up half the night at the time that the Prime Minister of Israel, Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, appeared on the screen saying, "I know this is going to be difficult for some people, but I'm announcing a transaction. We've reached agreement, and we're going to be releasing X number of people, and some of them will have, what's the expression? Blood
Blood on their hands.
on their hands." An awful circumlocution. And my heart goes out. My heart goes out to the victims and blah, blah, blah. Now I say those words with considerable pain because on the day that my daughter was murdered, Bibi Netanyahu was not a politician, and he was visiting a place called Melbourne, Australia. And the news reporters caught him, saw him as a spokesperson for Israel, and this is 2001, and asked him for a comment on not only the massacre that had taken place in Jerusalem that day, but on the fact that an Australian family, in fact an Australian girl, my daughter was born in Melbourne, she had American citizenship, she had an American passport when we made Aliyah, but she was born in Australia. And I'm an Australian. So an Australian victim appeared on the front pages of all the newspapers in Australia, and for a moment there was a lot of news interest in the murder of my daughter, Malka Arnold Roth. And he said, and these were the exact words, "My heart goes out to the Roth family, and as soon as I return to Jerusalem, I shall go and visit them and express my sympathy and support." Now, there was a serious problem after that. The GPS broke down, and we think that he's probably still trying to find where we live in Jerusalem, and he's not yet turned up. In the meantime, he used the very same locution. "My heart goes out to the families," and blah, 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 blah. He also said at the time, and it's difficult for me to go into any detail about this because I think it's a very sordid story. He also said at the time, and I will be sending a letter of explanation to all of the families. To cut a long and rather unpleasant story short, my wife and I then bombarded the Prime Minister's office repeatedly for a period of some weeks with requests for the letter and for evidence that had been sent. Every victim of terrorism that we know, and we know many, whom we consulted, said that the letter had gotten lost in the mail before it reached them. And in fact, until today, I can tell you that I don't know a single person who received the letter. Yes, it was published on Facebook, and it was certainly referred to in the news, but at the simple, basic level of being a human being, where the Prime Minister said, "I'm sending out a letter as a reflection of the fact that my heart goes out," something went wrong. And as I've subsequently learned, that something that went wrong was both systemic and consistent. There's something seriously wrong in the view that the government has taken to both the terrorists and their victims. We were aware that there were people looking to torpedo the Shalit deal. We didn't think that that was doable, and we particularly were concerned not to get caught up in any attempts to persuade the High Court of Justice, or as it's called in Hebrew, the Bagatz, to rule against the deal. That was a loser from the beginning. That was clear to anyone with his eyes. What we did do, and we did it with passion, was begin a campaign which only had 3 days of life because the government played all the cards that they could play. They notified us at the very, very last minute, basically intending that no one would have any opportunity to do anything about it. But we did what we could. We decided to focus only on Ahlam Tamimi. We said she has no place being on that list. Don't tell us that the life of Gilad Shalit depends on her. She is less than 0.1% of the human material that you're proposing to throw out of the Israeli jails. We're not going to argue with you about the idiotic notations that you're selling to the Israeli public about who these people are. We won't argue with you when you say some of them have blood on their hands. We've done our own calculations. We've looked at the records. I don't know a single journalist who did what we did. Many more than half, close to 2/3 of the people on that list were murderers, are murderers. You don't want to say it to the public? I'm sure you have your own reasons. I'm not a politician. I'm not going to argue with you. So let's have the deal. Go ahead with the deal. We're not doing anything against it. Take the woman off the list. Take the woman who has given television interviews, who's been photographed on the front page of the second section of the New York Times. Take the woman who is a byword in the Palestinian Arab world and the Islamic hinterland that provides it with its critical support. Take her off the list! Not only did we not succeed, but even when we reached almost 10,000 names on the petition that we threw up overnight and which we only had 2.5 days to promote, even then we couldn't find a single minister in the government of Israel, including ministers who you'll tell me you liked and that they're real human beings and decent fellows, not a single one of them who was prepared to receive from us, even as a symbol, the petition with the almost 10,000 names. So what we were left with to do was to speak to the media. We were very careful, my wife and I. We didn't say something critical about the government of Israel, other than to deal with the consequences of what we think, not thought, think, is a catastrophic decision. Now allowing 1,027 highly committed, unrepentant terrorists who are perceived in Palestinian Arab society as being the cutting edge of the war against the Jews and setting them loose. We didn't say that there was something wrong with the government's decision. We said that there was something wrong with the outcome of that decision. We didn't criticize politicians. We said this is a decision which ordinary people like us will suffer for generations. Bechiyah ledorot, as it's called in Jewish tradition. We spoke to the BBC and the ABC and the CBC and the NBC. We spoke to anyone who would agree to listen to us. We were prominently displayed in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Figaro, a long list. People in the working media in Israel, not, as many of you may know, deeply committed Zionists, most of the people who work the Middle East, particularly in Jerusalem, are not friends of Israel's position. They're critical. I want to tell you that one after another, the journalists in our kitchen, in our living room, on our balcony, said to us, can't understand this decision. Can't understand why the government of Israel would want to do this. Well, I can tell you that we still don't understand. Well, the postscript to this is no less unpleasant than the process that I've described until now. About a year after the release of 1027, and long after the murderer of our child, Arnold Tamimi, was safely sent into what was euphemistically called exile. What does exile mean? She was sent to Jordan, the country where she was born, where her family lives, where she had lived until about a year before she came to Ramallah to do her university studies. Exile, that's some exile. She was sent to the arms of her family. But exile was a politically loaded word in order to show the government of Israel is thinking hard about the impact and it's doing something which is going to comfort the terror victims. Of course, it doesn't comfort the terror victims at all. It was a joke. About a year after she'd been repatriated to Jordan, we learned that there were efforts to have her so-called fiancé released into the same place where she was. Now, let me explain that more carefully. Her name, Arnold Tamimi, ought to be recognizable to anyone who knows the geography of the Middle East and of Israel. The Tamimis are a large clan who are found in many parts of Israel, of the Arab world, but their ancestral home is in a place called Nabi Saleh, which was on the front page of the New York Times magazine about 2 months ago, in a terrible article by a fellow called Ben Ehrenreich, talking about the nobility of the peace-loving residents of Nabi Saleh. The article is a subject for a separate discussion, but there was another young man from Nabi Saleh, also a Tamimi, who was her cousin, her father's brother's son. And in the course of her imprisonment for 16 life terms, she became engaged by proxy to him. At various points, the Palestinian Arab media and the sections of the media that are supportive of them referred to him as her husband. Of course, there was no such thing. In fact, they either never met or met once in their lives many years before. The details, in my opinion, are not important. The entire strategy was to create a totally bogus Romeo and Juliet, kind of West Side Story of the Middle East. And a year after the release of Arnold Tamimi, the fiancé, the cousin, the husband, suddenly appeared at the Allenby Bridge. And why is this significant? Because the exile to which, on the basis of which he was released, was that he was exiled to the area occupied by the Palestinian Authority. In other words, on the papers, under which he was released from Israeli prison in the course of the 1027, the Shalit deal, he was told, you cannot go to Jordan, you cannot go to Israel, you must stay under the jurisdiction of the PA. It's my opinion that no one meant that seriously. And as you'll see, I was right. We discovered, by looking at the Arab media, I read the Arab media every day with the help of Google Translate, because I'm always looking to see what's happening with this woman. I found that he had turned up at the Alney Bridge and had demanded the right to cross over to Jordan to be reunited with his beloved we'd never met, or met once. And we had a speech by the beloved from the other side of the river saying, we have a deal with the Israelis. Why have they broken the deal and not allowed him to cross the bridge? That rang alarm bells. That same day, I pulled some connections that I had in the government, I made some inquiries, and I was told, you must turn your attention to the Mossad. That's where you'll get the answer. And I wrote a letter that day to the Mossad, and I said, I demand to know whether these reports in the Arab media are right. Are you, the government of Israel, going back on your own word in saying that he may never leave the PA? Don't you understand the implications of him being released to go over to the other side of the Jordan, to be reunited with this monstrous woman who killed 15 people, the 16th woman is still unconscious, and who says she did the right thing and she hopes everybody else does the same thing? Do you not get it? It took, as I remember now, about 2 weeks to get an answer. The answer came from the Prime Minister's office, Prime Minister of Israel. And the letter says, indeed, we have changed the conditions and he is free to go. The last words were, Terem Yatsa. He has not yet gone out. I understood those words when I received them to mean, run, don't walk, to the Bagatz while there's still time and get an order preventing him from being reunited with her and making babies that will become celebrities in the Palestinian Arab world. So we did. We retained legal counsel. We were in the Bagatz the next day. And we then entered into a kind of a protracted discussion with the Prime Minister's office and the Ministry of Justice, at the end of which we were told, we're waiting to hear, we'll get back to you shortly. This was from one of the government officials. I'm not going to go into the details beyond what I just said. At the end of the last day that we were prepared to wait, we got a phone call after the close of business, and it said, these weren't the exact words, but the message was, oops, actually he left 3 days ago. When we try to put ourselves into the shoes of people who become victims of a process of terrorism, it's easy to lose sight of some of the major consequences, such as the total unravelling of the system of justice. Justice is a terribly overused word, but it still means something. Justice underpins pretty much everything we think about the way law and order and enforcement works. It can't be arbitrary, it can't be made up on the spot, and it can't exist in a vacuum. It must serve something, it must serve a purpose. If the murderer of children, who says, I'm glad I did it and I'm going to do it again and I'm going to tell other people to do it as well, can be released 10 years after she was imprisoned, and while she's still of childbearing age, she's not even 31 years old, can be released without any murmur of objection. Released into the hands of the Kingdom of Jordan, with whom both Israel and the United States have friendly relations, where she was received on that day, the same day that she arrived, the day after the Shalit deal, in the family court. I can't tell you why the family court, I only know that I've got photographs of it. She was received at an official reception celebrating her freedom in the family court of the Kingdom of Jordan, with whom Israel and the United States have diplomatic and friendly relations. Does anybody stop for a minute to think what the victims of this woman might be thinking as they see this kind of news reported? I asked myself whether the ambassador of Israel was there as well. I suspect that he was not there, but actually, given the circumstances, that this was a perfectly legitimate, open event, no one was doing anything criminal or wrong, she was released, she wasn't forgiven, she wasn't given an amnesty, she was simply released, her sentence was abridged, then why shouldn't the ambassador of Israel have been there? Why shouldn't the delegate of the World Jewish Congress have been there. I'm not for a moment suggesting that they were. I am suggesting that there is something fundamentally wrong with a system where the politician who stands at the head of it can express himself in terms of "my heart goes out," but when put to the test, will sign off on documents that are a travesty of justice. Well, since then, I can tell you the way this has played out. It's a work in progress, but it's devastating. I don't know if it's devastating for you. I would guess not. It would be not reasonable for you to be devastated by something that devastates me. You know why it devastates me. No reason why it should devastate you. But it's devastating. The woman has her own television program. It's broadcast every Friday night on Al-Quds, which is a satellite network owned by Hamas, which reaches every part of the Arabic-speaking world. She's a major personality. She travels freely throughout the Arab world. She has appeared in Qatar, in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Egypt, of course in Jordan, in Lebanon. There doesn't seem to be any reason for her to curtail her travel activity, and so long as she's able, and for the moment, until she gives birth, she's able. Her marriage, her wedding, was covered by live broadcast on Jordanian television. I know this, now you know this, but I can tell you that almost no Israelis know this. It wasn't reported at all. And one gets the impression that the reporting of the wonderful life that is being bestowed on the shoulders, the totally undeserving shoulders of this woman, is something that the media are simply embarrassed to report upon. It would make a travesty of all of the undertakings that were given at the time that we were told we must do everything to see Gilad Shalit released. Now please don't misunderstand me. I'm as happy as everyone else was to see Gilad Shalit released, but I'm not so naive as to think that there was no other side to the argument. There certainly was, and there is. When you decide to do quote-unquote everything, which no one ever intended, they didn't mean everything, but when you say that you want to do everything, you're leaving yourself open to the possibility that truly awful things will follow. Other people, for example, will be murdered by the people who have just been released. Does that not play in your thinking? Do you simply put that down to the great lottery, the raffle, which many people think that life is made up of? It'll be bad luck for whoever gets killed, but it doesn't much matter whether the killer was released by the Israelis or was freshly born or was imported from Boston. There's something fundamentally wrong when we close our minds to those consequences and justify our actions by the fig leaf of this is a humane gesture. We must do everything we can to bring the soldier home. No one denies that we must. We must do whatever is reasonable to bring the soldier home because we have a moral obligation and because we want to see his parents not suffer. But it's not an equation with only one side to it. There is another side to the equation, and the other side is, and we know there will be a cost. What makes that equation a very stinky equation is when we recognize that the other side of it, the part about the pain, about the cost, about the ongoing drama, is hidden. It's deliberately obscured by the people responsible for putting information out there in the media. Let me just say one more thing, and in fact I've pretty much reached the end, and I'll call upon you first. If you leave aside all of the conflict in what I've been describing, and go back to what this all began with, which is essentially an unthinkable loss, a terrible tragedy that was visited upon a very specific number of individuals. If you look at the city of Jerusalem, my guess is roughly 1,000 families, but no more. Roughly 1,000 families lost a child to an act of terrorist murder during the period starting with Rosh Hashanah of 2000, which was the start of what I call the Arafat War, until today. It's not the end of the world, but it is the end of the world for the families who are in that 1,000. And every one of them finds it necessary to ask the same question that I asked, my wife asked, my family asked, which is, what do we do now? What do you do now? What do you do the morning after your child has been murdered? Let's say 2 mornings after, because the morning after she was murdered, we had to prepare ourselves for a funeral. What do you do a month later or a year later? What do you do when wedding invitations come in? What do you do when friends from school either come and speak to you or don't come and speak to you? What do you do when people stop you on the street and say, "Hey, how are you?" A day, a week, a month after your child has been murdered. There are no bad people in this story. Perhaps there are. Perhaps the people who are bad are the people who should be addressing this because it's their responsibility to address it at the level of policy and education and national institutions. But what do you do? Well, here, I can only describe what we have done because I want you to know about it, because I think that it's an inextricable part of the process of loss played out against community life. We're parts of a community. We moved to Israel not because it's the Bahamas. We didn't go there for the weather or for the employment opportunities or any other consideration. We moved there because we have a conviction that Jewish life is most naturally played out, lived in Israel, as compared with everywhere else on earth. I wasn't born in Israel, but I had the privilege of making the decision to raise my children there. And I'm very glad, I'm proud that I did, and I'm very proud of the outcome. I'm very not proud and very sad, very hurt by the loss of a child, loss to an act of murder, loss to an act of terrorist murder, hatred, the kind of hatred that will lead people to do the same thing again and again and again. They're not satisfied with one of my children. I'm glad that the life that we're living is being lived in Israel. But then what do you do? What do you do in a real practical sense? What do you do in the morning after your child has been stolen from you? Her future, your life. So here I think Judaism has something very constructive to offer, and this isn't the time for me to elaborate on this. I've spoken about it on other occasions because it is an important issue in terms of the way I feel, one of my passions in life. But I'll say it briefly. We felt that we wanted Malki's life to be connected with acts of good. I've already told you about how she picked up her sister, did remarkable things that reflected love and empathy. We created a foundation in the first days. We decided, family and I, sitting together on the floor in our home when the guests, people had come to give us their support during the 7 days of mourning had left, to create an organisation that would embody Malki's attitude to children with special needs. To cut a long story short, we immediately set out to create the legal entity, and 30 days after the murder, on the same day as the Shloshim, the papers came out, and we had registered Karen Malki. That date was the 11th of September 2001. So that from our point of view, the events that happened later that day in New York and Washington became connected with our own personal loss. And I have felt the need over and again to explain to Americans that the experience that Israelis have had with terrorism provides, I think, a valuable commentary to the challenges facing American life, even if Americans themselves, by and large, either never understood it or have already forgotten it. I think that it's totally forgotten in New York, by and large. I think that in Boston it's going to be forgotten by tomorrow morning. And I think that there's something very disturbing, very saddening about the way in which people are constantly looking to sweep away the broken glass and look beyond the terrorists. Or in Hebrew terms, in Israel, it's called not giving the terrorists a victory. This is absurd. The terrorists have already scored their victory. They scored their victory when we buried our children. We make their victory much more significant when we pretend that it didn't happen, or that it happened as a warning, and we'll make sure that the warning doesn't lead to something worse. It already led to something worse. It led to something unthinkable. We decided that we didn't want to be characterized in the way that the Palestinian Arabs self-characterize themselves. We are so desperate, we are so angry, that we have to slaughter your children. This is absurd. This is a sick, pathological culture. We created an organisation that reaches out to families who have a special needs child. We empower the families by giving them equipment and by funding non-medical therapies: physical, occupational, horse, speech, and water. Those are the 5 therapies. We've given between 40 and 50,000 such therapy reimbursements. We don't provide therapists, we provide funding so that the family can go off and pick the best therapist, engage the therapist to do what their child needs, and not have to worry about the money. We also send to the residents of the far south of Israel and shortly in the far north as well, our own therapists. Therapists on wheels, we call it. We could give those families an open check. They wouldn't have the therapists on which to spend the money, so we send them to therapists. This is the way I want Malki to be remembered. This is a Jewish response to a tragedy which was characterized by hatred and murder and anger. You can't out-terrorize these people. You can't out-anger them. And to engage in murder because they're murderers is absurd. So it does me good to know that we're doing this in the name of my daughter, even for Arab families. In fact, about 30% of the families for whom we provide this support are drawn from the Arab parts of Israeli society. To me, this makes a lot of sense. Until, I would say, the last year, the work of Karen Malki has in some ways been better known in the United States than in Israel. However, this past Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day before Yom HaAtzmaut, which is Independence Day, we had the privilege of being part of an event at Knesset in which Malki's life was remembered in a very moving and short video clip, which we'll show if we get the opportunity here, and a brief interview with Frimet, my wife, and me, in which we explain how we've tried to connect our daughter's memory with something positive and uplifting. Before I stop speaking, I'll say something which may seem obvious, but I think it needs to be said anyway. Whatever we do in the name of our daughter is not going to bring her back. Whatever we do is not going to ameliorate, to somehow lower the pain level of what was caused. That's not why we do it, nor is it an act of revenge, not in the traditional sense, not in the conventional sense. What we do is meant in some larger cosmic sense to add something positive to the world. It will not bring back our daughter, and therefore when we go and argue that the murderer should have been left in prison, and please God, will be sent back to prison one of these days, we say this not out of revenge, but out of a sense that justice has not been done, and justice is fundamental to living in a society. If we didn't have justice, we'd be eating each other alive. The fact that politicians don't grasp this, not in the United States, not in Israel, and not anywhere else, is, to my mind, a deplorable thing. I want to thank you very much for your attention. I'm certainly interested to hear your comments, and I hope you will also see the video.
You mentioned the media. Why do you know or think or believe that the media in Israel was so silent about was it pressure? Was it pressure from the government that we have to make this deal? That it's, this is how we Jews think. And why were they not against this release?
I'm fond of giving complicated answers and frightened of simple answers. So I'm not going to give you a complete answer, but I'm going to throw out a few thoughts that may lead you to an answer, at least to share the same answer that I have. It isn't the government pressuring the media ever. It's always the other way around. The media is always much more of an influence on the politicians than the other way around. I think that's true in many countries. It's certainly true in my mind in Israel. It wasn't always true. Sorry, you said something?
I said it's here too.
I have no idea. I don't even speak the language yet. In the case of the Shalits, they had a bit of time. The momentum was not always with them. I think over time there was a kind of a coming together, a consensus around the idea that a really serious effort needs to be made. Some of the people who took a leading role clearly had an overtly political agenda. In other words, if we demonstrate that we can be rid of a significant number of terrorists, we will have put a pin in the balloon of those who say that this is a war about terrorism. We'll show that it's not. The terrorists are marginal to the whole issue. There was also something, and you'll forgive me for being a little bit, you know what, I won't even say it. So,
No, say it.
No.
It stays in this room.
No, you must understand that there's a lot. First of all, the video camera's right.
Turn off the
You
camera.
must understand that a lot of what I say here runs very close to the edge of something that I try always to avoid doing. I don't criticize anything about Israel outside of Israel. Now, obviously, I've gone a lot further here today than I normally do. But there's reason for this. The manipulation of criticism for political ends leads to very bad outcomes, and I don't want to be part of that. In fact, I'm very much part of an alternative direction. And I'll only mention one issue because I mentioned it to Doris, who told me that Professor Richard Landis has been a visitor and a speaker to this group in the past. And I worked closely with Richard. We're colleagues in an effort which is going on like these hours and these days to force a reconsideration of what happened in the famous incident of Mohammed al-Dura at Netzarim in September 2000. Al-Dura is now the subject of a revisionist report by the government of Israel from the week before last. Much of it based on work that Richard's group, of whom I'm a player, in which I'm a player, has come up with. The evidence is simply overwhelming. Anybody who believes that Mohammed al-Dura was shot dead by Israeli soldiers who fired at him for 45 minutes is a fool, let alone speaking, let me say that more simply. You can't see the evidence, you can't look at the evidence and come away thinking that's what happened. It's simply not credible. You can look at the evidence and come to a completely different conclusion. But my point here is that it took 13 years for the government of Israel to come to the point where it stopped apologizing for the killing of al-Dura and said, well, not only didn't we do it, but we think it never happened. That's quite a breakthrough. It took 13 years. I don't think there's a parallel for it in Israeli history.
Well, actually, the same thing happened with Jenin. Remember with Jenin, I think it was Jenin, where they actually apologized, and then afterwards it turned out that, wasn't that the same situation?
I'm not aware of any statement by the government about Jenin. Of course, what you just characterised in terms of the facts is right.
Same thing, they backtracked.
I'm Australian, and in Australia, the definitive word about what happened in Jenin was given by a journalist called Peter Cave, who until today says there was a massacre. Okay, so it wasn't 1,000 people, it was 23, or whatever the number is, but still, that's a massacre. There is so much hypocrisy and so many double dealings around this subject that you don't have in that situation, in my opinion, a considered opinion in the name of the State of Israel saying, actually, that's not what happened. I don't believe that happened in Jenin, but it has now happened with al-Dura. And let me point out to you something you probably already know, which is that we've seen a barrage of criticism against the government's decision to come out to deny the truth of the al-Dura hoax from within the Israeli media. You have devastating reports. Haaretz had an editorial under its own name last week saying the report is wrong, it's dishonest, it confuses, and on and on and on. So we're dealing with a situation where the media is, at least we can say, politicized, deeply politicized, and where some of the checks and balances that we associate with the media and with the civil society are deficient, not working as they should.
Does Israel have a death penalty for anything?
No. Only for...
Yes, it does. It does. Adolf Eichmann was put to death in the name of the death penalty, but in practice, no. In the case of terrorists, the argument has always been, no, if we put them to death, then it predetermines the outcome when Israelis are taken prisoner by the terrorists. I don't support or criticise the position. I simply say that that's, I think, what you could say about what goes on to that.
Well, that doesn't make sense.
None of it makes
I
sense.
mean, but you're saying, if you have the death penalty for terrorists, the Israeli government position is that if an Israeli is captured, automatically he will be put to death. The Israeli who is captured is usually put to death anyway, but the Israeli is not the terrorist. It's the terrorist who is capturing him who is the terrorist. And somehow you're saying that is the logic why Israel doesn't have the death penalty.
That's their logic.
I have to say that there's also a strong view emerging in Israeli society now in the wake of the Shalit transaction, which says that if we had the death penalty, some of these issues would become less vexing.
I agree with that.
The society wouldn't be torn apart. Excuse me. Part of the problem here is that Israeli society, by and large, was not torn apart. The support for the Shalit transaction on the eve of its happening was over 80%. I don't know that there's any issue since the invention of ice cream where so many Israelis were united around in support of one issue. There's certainly nothing in political life that's ever achieved that kind of support. Now let me point out to you, again, without in any way wanting to demean the case for Gilad Shalit as a human being, that the evidence we now have for what he did on the day that he was captured and in the days after it make for very hard reading. He did everything wrong. He did things that should have led to a court-martial and led to the result that other people were killed. That's before we start speaking about the price paid in the wake of the release of the 1027. So there's a certain second opinion setting in Israeli society, and some of it involves a very lively debate around whether Israel should not bite the bullet and embrace the death penalty, given the way in which captive terrorists have turned into a lever against us in ways that nobody ever imagined, and with our own connivance.
How many terrorists who murdered are still left in Israeli prisons, so you'll get another Gilad Shalit with the same demand? What do we have?
About 4,000. I don't say that they're all murderers, I frankly don't know, but about 4,000 prisoners who are the subject day after day of agitation, mostly by the Palestinian Authority, because politically they're the victims of the Gilad Shalit transaction since the victory went to Hamas. So the PA have been pushing hard to have a prisoner released connected with their name. And it's absurd. We're bending over backwards to accommodate the rivalries in the political world of the Palestinian Arabs. If I may, over there and then over.
First of all, thank you for your talk. It's incredibly moving and horrible. But the thing that really mystifies me, and I hope you speak to, is why is 80% of the Israeli public in favor of this? This is nuts. What that transaction was insane. Even if Gilad Shalit was a great hero, to release those people is, it just ensures future death. Obviously, what's going on with the Israeli psychology?
Believe that Israelis think differently from other people. I'm going to argue against you. I don't know that any other society would have reacted very differently. The issues were played out in very emotive terms. I also want to tell you that people like us, my wife and me, we're not raving lunatics. You can see that I'm not a foaming at the mouth radical. We got almost no coverage in the Israeli media. I don't say no coverage, almost no coverage. And in the end, the most substantive coverage happens to have come from Haaretz, who sent a journalist to sit with us on the morning of the release and wrote a very moving article. But that was already too late. In the weeks and months leading up to the release of Shalit, our voices were absolutely ignored. In the same way, when the release was already done and we were trying to get information about that letter of my heart goes out to you, and then trying to stop the fiancé husband from crossing the bridge, we were treated like pariahs. And you'll say, that's inconceivable, but it's very conceivable. If you have either no agitation by the media or agitation in the direction of, oh boy, we can hardly wait until Gilad Shalit is released, and no relationship to the contra side, to the price that's going to be paid, what can I tell you? You're an American, you know. Most people don't think. Most people react to the stimulus that the outside society provides to them. That's the nature of the world. So most people at that stage were delighted until a minute later. I don't say that the 80% turned into 20%. I frankly don't know, and I wish that there would be polls. But certainly after a major article by Ben Caspit, an Israeli journalist, about a month or so ago, where he writes in the most derogatory terms about what Shalit actually, again, it's not an attack on Shalit, it's good that he's alive at home with his family, but the things that he did on the day, he threw his gun down, he ran with the Arabs, he did everything to make the process go smoothly for them. You can't read that with some sense of what the consequences were and say, oh well, small issue. It's a very big issue. But it wasn't covered at all. It was hidden, and many other issues of the Shalit transaction remain hidden today.
What do you suppose has gone on in the psyche of the Israeli politicians that has transformed them from people who, rightly in my view, sent agents to track down and kill every one of the terrorists who murdered the Israeli athletes in Munich, to people who seem now unprepared to defend their own interests?
It's a decisive question, and much better than the answers I can offer. First of all, my problems begin with the Prime Minister. And because of what I said to you before about how I avoid criticising public figures out in the State of Israel outside of the border of the State of Israel, I confine myself to something that I've said in writing already. And what I've said in writing already, again and again, is the textbook of how to deal with terrorist demands was written in 1996 in a best-selling book which speaks about the utter impossibility of negotiating with terrorists and the utter inadmissibility of conceding to their demands. This book was written by Bibi Netanyahu. It states, chapter and verse, what one must do and what one must never do. When put to the test, the Prime Minister did precisely what he said one must never do, and that he excoriated leaders from other countries for having done. When put to the test, he did precisely that. How, why, when, who? I can only say, I think I've already said, perhaps I didn't say it here, I say it at every opportunity. I'm not a politician, and I'm not in favour of politics, and I don't like politics, and I try to avoid any encounter with politicians. But I also want to say something else about the way politics works in Israel. And this is not a subjective criticism, it's an observation which you may not have made, and perhaps if you have, I'm wasting your time, but I'll say it anyway. You have here in the United States two kinds of elected representatives at the federal level. One kind is called senators, and one kind is called congressmen. What they have in common with each other, and do not have in common with Israeli politicians, is... Okay, complete the sentence. Put up your hand. Who knows?
Well, they're elected directly.
Hello, that's unusual. For some reason, most Americans don't seem to recognize this.
Yeah.
You've got it exactly right.
Right.
Say it again, more fully.
Well, they're directly elected by the people. We did not always have that. Most of the senators in the early days of the Republic were elected by the state Senate. Lincoln won the majority vote for Senate against Douglas, but Douglas was elected by the state Senate of Illinois, so Douglas went to the Senate and not Lincoln. And that's why we got Lincoln as a great president, otherwise we might not have had him.
And in Israel?
And in Israel, you're on a party list, and,
No one has ever been elected to the Israeli Knesset in his own right.
Right.
No one. No prime minister. One prime minister, Netanyahu, in a system that lasted for, I think, 1 or 2 cycles and then was rejected. Politicians are elected according to lists. As we just saw now with the smashing victory of the Yair Lapid, politicians arrive in the Knesset, no one's even heard of them. No one expected him to win that many mandates. At the more fundamental level, I'm not now speaking about the superficial, at the more fundamental level, what this means is the Israeli parliament is thoroughly, I'm not going to speak into the microphone now. The Israeli parliament is populated thoroughly from wall to wall with people who do not owe you, me, a thing. You call up your local congressman, well, first of all, there isn't such a thing. You call up a congressman, I'm speaking about Israel, and you say, I'd like a meeting with you, and he says, well, I'm busy this year.
There's no representation.
There's no reason to do it. There's no benefit, there's no political payoff, there's nothing. They don't owe you anything. Once you understand that, you can understand that almost anything can be done for good and for bad.
Are you willing to speculate the possibility that there might be some external pressures have come into Israel, such as America, in some subtle way of getting this Shalit situation resolved a lot? Because we're, you know what I'm driving at, and I will respect if you don't want to answer it, but somehow I feel it wasn't, I don't think this operated into a vacuum. I think there was more involved in that than that.
So no and yes. No, I don't mind speculating. And yes, I do think that there is some basis to it, but since it's only speculation, it makes no sense for me to tell you what I think.
Okay.
Please.
I'd like to go back to the detail in your story about the Palestinians who turned in this woman.
Okay.
Is there a community of dissidents? Is there any hope that many people do not want to live in this pathological culture? Is there a group of people that we could support, that the United States could support financially or with protection? Is there any hope at all for that culture?
It's an excellent observation. The serious answer is that yes, such people exist. I'm not sure that they constitute a group, but if you wanted some positive outcome from this, you'd have to be doing probably the exact opposite of what the United States government is doing, not only the US government, probably also the Israeli government.
Churchill had the same policy. Churchill said he would not criticize the British government outside of England. He simply criticized them constantly inside of England.
Yeah, but I want to take it a step further. Churchill didn't read the Parasha of the week. And yesterday in Shul, when we read Parashat Shalach, it spoke all about the so-called spies, the Meraglim, who were not spies at all, who spoke badly about the land that they saw, and we all paid a bit of price for it. So I don't want to be one of those. There are certainly people within Palestinian Arab society, and I know some of them who are appalled with what's being done in their name and to their own societies. But it's a society which has zero commitment to democracy and open channels. It's a society driven by fear, no matter whether we're talking about Gaza or civilized East Jerusalem. It's a society driven by fear. It's a society in which the dominant player on the PA side is a political figure with a coterie of parasites hanging on to his coattails, who were elected for a term of 4 years, 9 years ago. And the point is not lost on the Palestinians. They read the map better than any of the American observers, and I know some of the American observers as well. To put this in a different way, if you had to make a life-threatening call, a life-threatening to your own life, threat to your own life decision, based on the expectation that the good guys would come riding in at the right moment, you would not see the Americans as being the good guys. The Americans, nor the Israelis for this matter, are really there to strategically encourage you, or even are in a position to achieve much for you. It's a society where the people get killed at night, where the police are totally ineffective, and where independent thinking is not encouraged. There's no grassroots of silent majority there. Silent majority go to the mosque and do what they're told. The elite, some of the elite, the political thinkers, are offended in exactly the way that you've said, but will not express themselves, not in the way that you're saying. Some have done, and it's very striking. I'm in personal contact with several such people, and it would be entirely a miscalculation to think that there's something there that we can encourage and bring it out. None of us have ever, unless we've lived in Eastern Europe, you lived in Eastern Europe, will ever understand what it means to live in a really undemocratic society. It's a different world, it's a different planet. And for us to try to project onto them values that entirely depend on a free and open democracy for their good sense and for their validation, it would be a terrible mistake. So, no, I'm sorry, but there's not much to hope for.
You know, when you just said that, it struck me that this is a society, I never thought of it like this. I'm an attorney that does a lot of family law, primarily. And I see a lot of victims, because I spent 17 years in juvenile dependency court, which deals with abused children. It's a society of people who are victims of domestic violence. Only the domestic violence is from the government. And if you know anything about the mentality of people who are victims of domestic violence, whether it's male or female, though it's primarily female, all they want to do is not get their oppressor upset, because they know that, I mean, I've spoken to a lot of women who have had this, the mentality is that if we do anything to stand up to them, the oppression will be worse. So we'll take what we can get, we'll take the few blows that we can get, we'll do what we have to do, because the alternative will be worse, and there's nobody who's going to help us. And the fact is, America's not going to help them. Nobody's going to help them. And there's, you know, it's even the revolutions that they have, or the so-called revolutions, the spring, the winter, whatever you call it, you know, it's what led to nothing, it's led to worse.
So I'll make an observation, and I'm going to say I shouldn't be standing up here. This is sort of a multilateral discussion at this point, and everybody's opinion should be expressed. The single most catastrophic policy decision that leads to the opposite of what's your name?
Susan.
What Susan was suggesting, how can we encourage the decent grassroots people to come forward, is this continued pretense that Mahmoud Abbas presides over a moderate government. The Abbas government not only is democratically illegitimate, but is thoroughly engaged in anti-Semitic day-to-day life, in the demonization of Israel and the claims of the Jews to the land, and in the oppression of its own people, including its media. Why he gets a free pass, and he does, from the American media in particular, is incomprehensible to me, unless there is some grand strategy, and I don't believe it. I don't believe that there is a grand strategy. So there are a lot of mistakes being made on a day-to-day basis, and they all conspire to produce the result that we just said. Children who are battered by their parents, or wives who are battered by their husbands, frequently are identified as being supportive, in public at least, of the person who's made their lives so bitter. It's only when you understand that you can begin to make sense of the things that you see out there in the field. For some reason, some of the smartest people we know don't understand that. I can't tell you why that
It's very
is.
simple.
Go on.
It's very simple.
Why?
No, I mean, it's very simple. The thing is that they don't believe that anybody's going to come to their help.
Oh, okay, so that's what I understand. I'm not understanding why people who look on at this don't draw the necessary conclusion and say that, hey,
Because it's the
why-
devil that you got. You know the devil that you got, you don't know the devil that you're going to get. So a boss is, as lousy as he is, do you think Obama gives a goddamn whether or not, excuse the expression, whether or not the people that are under a boss, do you think that he really cares about them? All he cares about that there should be shashtil. That's all he cares about. As long as things are quiet there, as long as things are sort of okay, as long as we have this pretense that a boss and Netanyahu are like, kind of like two animals that are kind of like looking at each other, but they're not fighting. As long as that's going on, we know the devil we got.
But I think it's more fundamental than that. The United States has written a script on a, quote, two-state solution, because with Gaza we now have a three-state solution. But that script has to be played out, and if you take a boss away from there is no one to play the role of the second state. So you go forward with the play. I don't think the people at the highest level in the U.S. government really don't know what Arab society is like. But they have to go on with the play that they've already written, because otherwise their policies are become crashing down upon their heads. We have this with Obama in, for instance, the number of terrorist attacks in the United States. There's actually been a number of them. One of them being the psychiatrist in Fort Hood, right? But it's Fort Hood, Texas. But it's listed as basically workplace incident more than a terror. And it's deliberate. It's a political choice to do it that way because it makes the administration look good, especially during an election year when it happens.
Yeah, but you're going for the easy hits. I want to ask you why so many Jews in this great United States. Now I have a request. I'd like to open up the discussion, but I want to have us have the opportunity to see a video clip that was shown to pretty much every family in the state of Israel just a few weeks ago. Because at the end of the day, I'm anxious that you should walk away from here at least knowing about the work of Karen Malki. We've brought some cards that explain its work, and we're trying to create some awareness. If we don't build awareness among good people, it'll be a lot harder to build awareness among people who are less good.
Before you
I'm sorry, is that your major function as Karen Malki? Is that what you do?
I'm the honorary non-executive chairman. Debbie Fishman, who's sitting here at the back, is the executive director. My wife's name is Frimet, and I devote as much time as we can, 20, 30 hours a week, most of the time. In the past it's been much more, to encouraging the organisation and making it move forward. I've always taken the view, as does Frimet, that if we were on the payroll, it would be hard for me to get up in front of people and look them in the eye and say, you should really make a donation. I can't do that. But I can do it when I can say, I'm here on my own time, and I always do this when I travel for my work. I always have a day job. I'm a lawyer, that's commercial work. I've been running a series of technology companies, most recently ETV, a developer of batteries for electric vehicles, which collapsed a year ago with the failure of 21 Ventures, a venture capital firm where the chairman of the company who appointed me took his own life. That was the end of the funding. I work for a living. I don't make any money from Karen Malki. I never have. So, yes, it is the main reason why I get up and talk about things. The truth is that I've also become a spokesperson for Israel in a variety of other forums, particularly those that have to do with terrorism. But that's soul-destroying work. There's so few people in the government of Israel, in the foreign ministry in particular, who really care to have a good job done on behalf of the state of Israel, that at a certain point you just say, what the hell am I doing this for?
מלכי מאוד נמשכה לילדים עם מוגבלויות, בכל מיני מסגרות, בהמון הקשרים היא הייתה נמשכת ועוזרת ומתנדבת ומה לא.
מטפטף לי דרך העיניים החומות, אז אני זוכר שיש ידיים
מלכי הייתה אחד מ-15 בעיקר ילדים, ילדות נרצחו בעצם בטבח במסעדת סברו במרכז ירושלים באוגוסט 2001.
בשעה 2 אני זוכרת שהבנים התקשרו אלינו. בעלי ענה וראיתי את הראש שלו, כשהוא מקבל את הבשורה.
מה אעשה אם תלכי לי, אם תברחי לי?
היה די ברור לנו ממש מהרגעים הראשונים שרצינו להנציח את מלכי ולחבר את הזיכרון הזה עם מעשים טובים, עם משהו טוב.
היה מאוד טבעי שזה יהיה קשור לילדים עם מוגבלויות.
יש לנו ילדה שסובלת ממגבלות מאוד חמורות, ומלכי הייתה מאוד מעורבת. זה היה החלק הכי חשוב בחיים שלה.
אבל מלכי מאוד מאוד תקשרה איתה ואהבה אותה ועזרה לי לטפל בה.
אז לכן החלטנו עם עיניים פקוחות לתת תמיכה לכל מי שיבוא עם ילד מתאים.
זה פשוט, זה משהו אדיר בכדי, אין שום קרן שעושה את מה שהקרן הזה עושה, אין שום קרן שמעניק את העזרה הזאת.
ידענו שאנחנו רוצים לעשות דברים שינציחו לא רק את השם שלה, אלא גם העשייה שלה, וזה מה שעשינו. היום יש ארגון בשם קרן מלכי, אני גאה להגיד שזה מוכר בעשרות אלפי משפחות במדינה, ואנחנו עושים כמה שאנחנו יכולים לעשות, להעצים משפחות שרוצים לספק את המקסימום לילד עם מגבלות, טיפולים פארה-רפואיים, ציוד ודברים כאלה.
אתה שומע, אין לי כלום בלעדיה, שמור לי
אנחנו בהתחלת הדרך, זה לא הישג. אני מקווה שעד הנשימה האחרונה שלי בחיים, אנחנו נמשיך לעשות דברים שא' מנציחים את מלכי וב' עושים טוב בקהילה של המשפחות האלה.
The story you've told us is the best illustration I have ever heard of why the appeasement of terrorism is exponentially more damaging than the terrorism itself. Do you compare, when you talk to government officials, if you can bear to talk to government officials, do you compare the appeasement of terrorism in Israel today to the appeasement before World War II?
No, it's a valid point. You should know that in the part of my life that involves talking to public officials, it's entirely functional. And I, without disclosing too many details, I'm deeply involved in a dialogue with the US government, myself personally, for my own interests, speaking in the name of only my wife, no one else. The arguments that we put are entirely based on, excuse the old-fashioned term, justice. We say that justice has been trampled here in ways that are historically unparalleled, and that it's not too late to undo at least some of the damage. It is too late for a lot of the damage. I can tell you that, how do I say this? There's more interest in hearing this in the United States than there is in certain other places that I might not want to mention here. It's beyond my comprehension how we got to this point. And I say that not because I'm stupid and not because I'm not aware of what goes on daily. It's beyond my comprehension. How can people who live their lives allow their children to go to the buses and the schools and the pizza restaurants of Israel, stand behind a decision like this? To a certain extent, I think the answer is they don't. That the lives of many of the decision makers are lived in different parts of Israel where there are guards and where no one goes on buses but go in cars. And you could make a whole case out of how the decision makers again and again make bad decisions because they don't feel themselves personally exposed. The most egregious example of this is what happened in Jerusalem on the actual day that Malki's life was thrown away by bad decisions. On that day, it was known through the Israeli intelligence network that a human bomb was on its way into Jerusalem. And the government, in the person of the Minister for Internal Security, I'm not going to mention the name, but I know very well who the person is, had to consider whether to put out a general alert. Knowing what we know now, there isn't a government that would have hesitated. They would have said, there's an alert, people should know about it, keep away from the centre of Jerusalem, don't go on buses, whatever the intelligence indicated. In this case, they decided that it would hurt tourism and create unnecessary alarm, and therefore nothing was said. So the authorities knew about it, but the public didn't. Now I want to tell you that in our family, we've always been super cautious, and if we had had even the faintest inkling, then we would have said to Malki, who had just come back from Edgarim, from the camp that I mentioned before, and who was planning to spend the day with her best friend Michal, our next door neighbour, in decorating the home of the bedroom of a girl who lives on the other side of Ramot from where we live, who was due to come back that day from a holiday outside of Israel. They decided that they were going to go over there and decorate the bedroom, welcome home, we love you, the usual thing that girls of 15 do. What she didn't say is that between that and heading off to a meeting of camp councillors, because there's a camp in Ezra was going to be the following week, they were going to go through the centre of town and pick up a pizza. I'm not sure we would have even said to her, don't do it. What is the risk? If my wife had called me and said, should I hesitate, I would have probably said, that's my role. I'm the husband, I'm the father, I'm the one who's supposed to calm everybody down. So I probably would have said, don't get hysterical, relax, take it easy. But if you don't know, then you can make those decisions much more easily. If you do know, you're a different person, you're empowered. And there are certainly people in positions of power in Israel, in a rather paternalistic way, who feel that you don't want to share that kind of information with the public because you don't know what they're capable of doing. But that's wrong. It's wrong democratically, it's wrong practically, and it's been demonstrated to have cost lives without any real justification.
I think there's a similar thing going on now with the appeasement, with the rock throwing, and the government's failure to do anything in response, to even stop them when they're doing it.
Does anybody know what Doris is talking about?
Yeah?
Yes.
I'm not sure how many people really understand this issue. You're absolutely right, and it is a classic embodiment of appeasement, only it's a form of appeasement that exactly costs both lives and health every single day. I happen to be a good friend of Michael Palmer, whose son Asher and his son, in other words Michael's grandson, were killed as a result of a rock throwing attack. And I sat through several of the court sessions at the military court not far from where I live. And I have to say it was a soul-destroying experience. In the end, the ringleader was convicted, but not after a lot of turbulent ups and downs. Now, the reality is that what was going on was a terror group that spent months readying a form of a boulder hurling attack. It wasn't rocks, it wasn't stones, it wasn't some slingshot. It was large rocks that were going to be, and were in fact successfully, propelled from a car heading in the opposite direction. This was a taxi. So here's the Palmers, here's the taxi, and at a certain critical point, which they practiced again and again on the roads, they hurled the boulder into the front windshield of the oncoming car. So there was a cumulative effect of this car going 100, and this car going 100, and the boulder was devastating. So Asher, the son, was almost certainly killed before the car left the road, and his baby was killed with the impact of the... This was an act of terrorism, lechol davar. Any doubt about that should be absolutely dispelled. This wasn't some chance, opportunistic development. This was a group of terrorists who trained for months to perfect the method and who intended the consequences. Now, those events happen in places like Beit Umar. I don't know if the name means anything to you. Beit Umar is just off the road to Efrat. Just go off to the right. 7 minutes drive from the southern edge of Jerusalem. Every vehicle going through Beit Umar these days is going to get rocks thrown through the window. And unfortunately, you need to go through Beit Umar to get to quite a number of the Jewish communities. The army has pretty much declared it a no-go area. In similar ways, though, and you'll forgive me for extending the appeasement analogy to other places, in similar ways, you see this happening today in Brussels and Paris, and certainly in London, and in other parts of Europe, who are essentially going down the tubes. They'll deny it, but they're going down the tubes. The Jews of Malmo in Sweden, I assume I'm telling you things you know, but if anyone doesn't know about these things, they will do, have suffered not because anti-Semitism has suddenly reared its head. Anti-Semitism has always been part of the fabric of life there, but because the authorities, in the name of what you correctly called appeasement, a losing strategy, have simply retreated. We won't deal with these people. You have to recognise that it's their turf, so keep away. Oh, you've been living here for 4 generations? Sorry. It's a devastating outcome, and there are some seminal documents that throw light on this. There's a television series that so far has not come out in English, which was shown on Channel 10 in Israel, which I have put up on the blog. My wife and I write a blog, I mentioned it before. It's called This Ongoing War, and it speaks in a much more public, in a much more political way about the issues that we never touch on in the work of Kerry Malki. It was a TV series which looked at the life of Central European cities today and the unsuccessful engagement that's going on between European life and the growing minority of disaffected Islamic citizens, people who hold passports. And what's happening here is it's a welfare payment fed society. The men, some of the men work hard, drive taxis, do whatever somebody who has a desire to be socially upward and mobile will do, and the women basically are making the babies, and those babies will all have Norwegian passports, and you can say goodbye to the old Norway, please.
What's a Muslim birth rate like in Israel proper?
Sorry, whose birth rate?
The Muslim birth rate.
It's pretty aggressive. It's part of the warfare. I can't tell you the number.
Is there a contest going on now?
If there is, we're not aware of it. They're winning by default. Look, I'll give you a slightly different angle to what you're saying. I spent a lot of time in pediatric wards. I have a very ill youngest child, and I've had some rather serious issues with one of my other children in the last 3 years. I spent a lot of time in hospitals. If you want to know what goes on in pediatric wards, I'm a good person to talk to. So I'll tell you. If you look at the hospitals in Jerusalem, at any given moment, any hour of the day, I'll take your hand, I'll walk in there with you, and I'll show you that about half the people in the ward are Arabs. Now, I'm not saying that's bad, and I'm not saying that's good, but it sure as hell ain't genocide. It sure as hell is not a system that's calculated to reduce the natural growth of the Palestinian population. I know much more than that. I know the super efforts that are made to do the right thing, to help them recover from their illnesses. There's a lot of inbreeding, a lot of family marriages within the clan, so you have an incredibly high rate of neurological illness among Palestinian Arab children. So they're grossly overrepresented. Unfortunately for me, I spent a lot of time in the neurological wards in hospital. And so what you see there is a cynical use of the system. And when I say cynical, I'll support that by an anecdote. With my own eyes, I watched a family who were next room from where my wife and I were with our youngest, call in the BBC, who happily played the role of documenting the latest war crime, the latest outrage of the Zionists against the Palestinians. So you had this pathetic situation where this family being given the best of the best. And anyone wants to argue with me, I'll argue right back. The best of the best. There isn't any medical care within 3,000 miles of the centre of Shaare Zedek Hospital that compares with what you get at Shaare Zedek. This family, egged on by political advisors, stand there with a dupe from the BBC and an embarrassed-looking spokesperson from Shaare Zedek standing off to the side, saying, the Zionists, they treat us despicably, and now another anecdote which supports the same.
Why did they throw them out of the hospital?
Because.
Politically
Can I say something else
It's
from a
horrible.
different angle?
Okay.
Stupidity.
Okay, I'm going to give another example. After Debbie.
I'll give you just another example. I have a very good friend who's a very senior pulmonologist at Hadassah. it's Shavuot, we're all at shul, and he's on call. So his beeper goes off, and he's called into Hadassah to help an Arab guy from Shechem who is got some complicated lung disease that is urgent for him to get treated on Shavuot. Now, so our friend, gives all the instructions and is, will do whatever he has to because he's a doctor and he'll go. But before he can go, it's the PA has to give their okay to let this poor dying guy come and get treated in Israel. So in the end, he gets it, and but that's the reality of what goes on every day. But we're living in, we're trying to.
The girl that I grew up with in Melbourne is a senior nurse, now retired, but was the senior nurse in Hadassah, Har Hatzofim, Mount Scopus, in the emergency room. And she told me this, that they have a continuing problem there of having a relative inability to deal efficiently with the large numbers of Palestinian Arabs who come to the emergency room. What's the problem? Many of the staff don't speak Arabic. So the hospital administration took the decision, we are going to put out a call, we're going to send people around, we're going to invite Arabs from the villages around East Jerusalem, Atur and Isawiya, all the neighborhoods that you hear about in the news all the time, telling them we're offering paid jobs, we want them to come in and be translators for the population of their own villages who are coming to be helped by our hospitals. PA got wind of it and put out the word, no one is permitted to offer this to the Zionists. So the game goes on with people.
Close the hospitals to power. I don't understand this. The world is going to call us fishers anyway. They've done it. They'll kill us anyway. So why are we making this pretense of being humanitarians when you're dealing with savages? They don't know anything but power. The weaker we are, the more they step on us, the more they kill us.
So I'll only say one thing about that. They're not all savages. The ones sitting in positions of power, by and large, are savages, and the rest of them are just as stupid as the rest of us.
But the thing is, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem.
I agree with you, but it's hard to be as mechanistic as that in your approach. It's hard, because you end up with situations that you would never want to see reported on the news. I'm not arguing against the
They're going to say it anyway. They say anyway that we kill their people. They say that we use their blood for our matzah. They're going to say it anyway.
Yeah, it's true, but we still have the ability to argue back and say your people are wrong.
You know what? Screw morals.
From my experience, the strength Israel projects is admired in the United States. The weakness is not. The 6-day war that you spoke about in the beginning had the same effect on me that you're talking about in Australia, only I experienced it in Alaska. I was in the Attorney General's office up there in a building called the Austro-Alaskan Building. You had a number of connections between Alaska and Australia, and that was the name of Australia, and that building was the Austro-Alaska Building. And the news on the 6-day war, we had better sources than down beneath here in what we call the lower 48. We did get, there was no satellites, but we did get the normal NBC, ABC, CBS, and that had the Arab propaganda that the Arabs were in Tel Aviv, the Arabs were attacking, the Jews were being dissolved in the first 2 or 3 days of the war. But we up there had a secondary source called Armed Forces Radio. And in Armed Forces Radio, they got their news, I'm sure, from the CIA. And we didn't get anything like that. So that gave us a little bit of hope that maybe it wasn't accurate. And finally, around the 3rd, the 4th, or 5th day of the war, Armed Forces Radio began reporting what was really happening. And you had the results. After that, the conclusion of the 6-day war, I was in a hotel in Anchorage, and we were after work, a group of us lawyers, having a drink, and a guy comes over to me and says, "Are you a Jew?" And I said, "Oh God, I'm going to have another fight." And I said, "Yes, I am." He shoved out his hand and said to me, "Boy, you Jews can fight." And I tell you, quite frankly, it is far better it is far better to project strength. Stop trying, you're right, stop trying to appease. Do what is right, do what is decent, do what is good, because it's what should be done. But don't do it because you feel you have to appease, you have to somehow get their goodwill or anything. You're not going to get their goodwill that way. That's the wrong way of doing it. And it's been a pleasure, pleasure isn't the right word, it's been an honor to hear you speak. Anyone who's Jewish has to feel a portion of the sorrow that you feel at the death of your daughter, but no one can possibly feel what you feel. But to share that with us, you grace us with your presence here.
Amen.
I'd like to go back to one of the taglines that Doris has, that somehow we as American Jews just don't get. Never again. And what does that really mean? Never again is really now, and we really have to stop appeasing now. It's not going to get us anywhere, as everybody has been saying.
Well, I'm feeling particularly depressed listening to you. But I feel like this is never gonna, it's not gonna end well for us. Because there's no strength in the people who have the ability to project that strength. If they're not gonna do it, what can we do?
I hope so, yes.
I don't feel that.
Well, that's good.
We're focused here only on fairly negative issues, and I blame myself for that. I've come here to speak about what I think is a dark chapter of the life of Israel. I'll tell you that almost throughout this period, and I can only offer my own life as aspects of my own life as an antidote to some of the negatives. First of all, as I've already mentioned to you, thank God I have the privilege of seeing children grow and serve in the military and partake of the best of Israel's education system and have children of their own. And I feel that the continuity of my family's life, a life which, as I said right at the beginning, was really snuffed out in Europe, is ensured in Israel. But at a much more prosaic level, almost all of my career, certainly since I came to Israel, has been in building technology businesses. I've been involved in drug discovery, in internet services, in the development of alternative energy. Israel is a throbbing, pulsating center of the universe for this, comparable with no one else. There's no one else outside of the United States, and the United States plays in a different league that is able to do what Israel does. And it translates into a lot of other aspects of life. You can make too much of what Israel does in the business sphere, but you can also make a terrible mistake by overlooking what Israel is doing. It's reaching beyond the obvious limitations of its capabilities, looking right beyond them, saying, why not? And going out there and doing things. Now, that's a very uplifting kind of an approach, because it means that if we're relegated to a particular playing field because of the limitations of our size or of our resources, we can never really do anything that is noteworthy. You would never have anybody coming through Southern California saying salute to Israel. There'd be nothing to salute. It would just be another, postage stamp-sized republic in some distant postal code with lots of sunshine like Southern California. That would be the end of it. But it's nothing of the sort. Israel is a vibrant laboratory for powerful social ideas. If you look, and I can only, off the top of my head, and I'm not speaking as a representative of the state of Israel, I'm speaking as one of you. If you look at the way in which the Ethiopians today are lawyers and public officials and members of the parliament and instructors at the university, it's breathtaking. We took a group of people only by reason of our affinity for them, our connection, which is a pretty remote connection. It's real, but it's remote. And we've dragged them from the Stone Age into the Twitter age in the space of 20 years. There's no parallel for this. If you look at one of the בעברית, אם נסתכל על הכוח של השפה, if we look at the power of the language, where the heck was this language 100 years ago? 100 years ago, how many people spoke Hebrew? Today we have literature, we have pornography in Hebrew, we have daily newspapers, classified advertisements, phone directories. Twitter versions of Windows. This is incredible. I grew up speaking Yiddish. Probably some of you here speak Yiddish from your home as well. Lo Yalenu, was it geschehen? Was it geworden in Yiddish? Where did it go? It disappeared.
They teach it at universities
It's true
now.
that they teach it, and they teach Sanskrit also. I'm not saying this because I'm dismissive of Yiddish. I love Yiddish. I listen to Yiddish at every opportunity. My parents sang Yiddish songs to me, and I listen for them, and I love it. It's evocative, but it's diminishing more than that. Acts of violence are being perpetrated against Yiddish every single day in the Haredi community. When I hear the Yiddish spoken in Bnei Brak and Mea Sharim, Simmer geworden finster by the way. It's terrible because the Yiddish it's being destroyed. So it's not to be assumed, not to be taken for granted that a language that is thousands of years old can be brought back to life and become the language of situation comedies and of reality television and of all of it.
And all our legal, a lot of our legal briefs, too, our little lawyers. A lot of it's used in our legal briefs all the time, Yiddish words.
I'm talking about Hebrew, but Yiddish is really is the victim. If you look at Yiddish today, again, I've seen some of you spend time in Israel. The Arabs, the rag and bone people who come through the streets looking for second-hand goods, what do they shout from their car to get your attention? Did you hear that? Al-Tizaki. It's an Arabic form of Yiddish. Al-Tizaki.